So, Ankush, this topic in particular is of real interest to me. 4 years ago, probably, I don't know, pretty close to the day even, I spoke to Sam Bagenstos. He's now a law professor at the University of Michigan, I believe it is. He had run for the state Supreme Court in Michigan, I think, last year. He served in the Clinton Department of Justice. I think it was in the OLC, and then came back after 8 years of Bush to the Obama Justice Department. I think it was in the civil rights. I may have that backwards, but the point is that he had the ability to see the Department of Justice pre-George W. Bush and post-George W. Bush, and he said it was a disaster. And of course, the Bush administration was there for 8 years. With that said, I think one could make the case, and I guess it's hard to know, but certainly in the way that the Department of Justice has operated, that these 4 years, it was almost like 4 years of Trump is like, like dog years in terms of the destruction of all agencies across the board. The Department of Justice, though, it's hard not to think that this suffered the most. Walk us through how at the very least, a department like this gets destroyed from 4 years of, I don't know what you would call it, maltreatment, abuse, internal degradation. How would you characterize what happens to an agency like this, particularly the Department of Justice?
It's such a fascinating question, because I think you're totally right. I think this is not unique to the Justice Department, but I think the Justice Department is one of our most important agencies. And, the thing that I wanted to sort of get at in the piece that I wrote was actually to sort of encourage people to think of the Justice Department sort of less uniquely than we typically think about it, and to think about it as another workplace, another large organization, whatever the case may be. And so I think if you think about like your favorite like large corporation or your favorite charity, whatever the case may be, some sort of large organization where you have a presumption that it's running well and it's being oriented toward the right goals. And all of a sudden, it's run for 4 years under a maniac who's basically telling you publicly that he's not doing the things he's supposed to be doing. He's changing all the priorities. He's tolerating all sorts of abuses. He's doing all sorts of things that are anathema to the goals of the organization. And meanwhile, those 4 years are going by. Nobody is complaining. People are getting promoted. People are leaving. And, things are carrying on as you would, as this person has sort of envisioned it. And then, at the end of those 4 years, the board of directors sort of kicks the CEO out. So sort of we're done with it, right? Now, what would you expect to have happened at the end of the 4 years, right? You wouldn't just say, oh, great, we're done. We fixed the problem. A lot of things have happened in those 4 years, right? People got promoted. How did they get promoted, right? They acclimated themselves to things that they probably should not have acclimated themselves, right? They flattered the right people. They compromised themselves in the wrong ways. They did things that they wouldn't have expected themselves to do at the very start, maybe because they wanted to keep their jobs. They were venal, whatever the case may be. And I think if you think about the Justice Department, now obviously the Justice Department has nobler goals than the average organization, and I have many friends there and has wonderful people there. But at the end of the day, they're all just people, right? Like they're all just people. They all want to keep their jobs. They all want to, do the right thing for themselves and their families. And at the margin, they're going to face the same sorts of challenges that anyone faces in a large organization, especially when those organizations sort of go awry. And, the internal mechanisms at, whatever the large corporation or charity that I've just, threw out there, if they're not doing anything for 4 years, you can't just all of a sudden say, okay, great, the CEO's out and, they probably are now ready to get back to work. Well, no, they're probably not, because they haven't been doing anything for 4 years, right? So something is probably wrong there too. So I think that's sort of like how I would suggest that's what I wanted to sort of encourage people to look at the department and think about it in sort of in that way, if that helps.
Right. I mean, people have adopted habits. They have been essentially, for lack of a better way of expressing this, they've been trained to respond to different incentive structure. And so let's, all things that could go wrong in a system. And it seems to me, though, and you would have a better sense, that the interesting thing about the Justice Department, as opposed to, let's say, the EPA, right, which is, I want to just stay on this as a sort of a generic procedural point for just one more moment, and then we'll move to sort of like the personnel aspects of it. But it seems to me that the Justice Department, more than other agencies, at least most other agencies, they have a multitude of different sort of agendas because there's so many subdivisions within the Justice Department, and there seems to be much more opportunity for discretion, both in terms of like the agency, like we could, as an agency, we're going to focus on terrorism versus white collar crime versus, civil rights versus, where an administration decides to put emphasis, implicates where resources go and, that level of discretion. But there's also seems to me to be more discretion in the context of each individual working in the Justice Department, simply because of the nature of the work that they do. That there's more opportunity for discretion in on almost like a daily set of decisions. Is that do I have a right sense of that?
That's absolutely true. It's one of the things that makes the job so enjoyable, and it's a great job. It was a great job when I had it, but you have a tremendous amount of responsibility, and if you're using that responsibility the right way, it's difficult. It's not just enjoyable because you have a lot of autonomy. It's difficult because you have people's lives in your hands. You're making big decisions, even in a narrow case. Prosecuting an immigration case, right, seems like a small thing, but it's going to change someone's life, right? It's going to change that person's family's life. Prosecuting a gun case is going to change that person's life. And you have competing values, obviously, and, you're there to, enforce the law, pursue justice and the like. But the thing that everybody always tells you when you start one of these jobs, both in and outside of the government, people who had the job or people who are sort of in the building, they always tell you, like, the one thing that you're supposed to do is just you do the right thing. Right? That is your singular mandate. Now, of course, that is a very amorphous thing, right? And a lot of people are going to interpret that in different ways, but you absolutely have a huge, huge amount of discretion. And just to back up to one of the other things that you touched on, I think the Justice Department does a lot more things than people realize. I think the lay person would probably associate the Justice Department first and foremost with criminal prosecutions, right? And that is a huge part of what they do, and is a hugely impactful part of what they do. But the department has 10,000 lawyers throughout the country. Okay, like it's a huge, huge legal organization, and they have their hands in antitrust work. They do environmental crimes prosecution, civil rights work.
10,000 lawyers. I had no idea, frankly. That's
it's huge.
There's no bigger law firm in the country. There's no, is there? There's nothing close to that. 10,000 lawyers. Is there?
I've thought about this before. I think it is the largest law firm in the country as well. I have not seen numbers on that, but I suspect that that's right. Most large law firms probably have a 2, maybe 3,000 people, I would guess.
That's my sense as well.
But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a huge, huge responsibility, and you have a tremendous amount of discretion day to day.
All right. So I think, we have a sense of at least what could go sideways and where the fragility lies in the context of any type of, 10,000 person, at least in terms of, and that's lawyers. We're not talking about all the support staff and the investigative units and et cetera, et cetera. That is a big, big enterprise with a bunch of people who are trained to make a whole host of decisions in discretion within, a lot of different silos. And so from a sort of like an enterprise perspective, you could understand how I think people can understand if you reorient an aircraft carrier, it's not so easy to turn it on a dime. 4 years is a long time to essentially make a machine like that function in a specific way. But let's talk about personnel. Like when we talk about the Justice Department, give us a sense of what are civil service positions, which are positions that are overtly political. We hear people talk about political appointees versus non-political appointees. And, how much of a turnover is there? How much does the idea that if I'm coming out of law school and I'm like, I want to be I want to be a prosecutor and I want to go after white collar crime. But then all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a second. There's not if I'm going to be a prosecutor, I'm going after white collar crime. It's not like I can go, there's only a certain amount of employers that are available to me. And if they're not hiring because they decide they're not going to do that anymore, I may go look for a different profession or at least a different field. Give us a sense of sort of of broad strokes, the type of personnel that populate these things: political, career, civil service, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's a very good and challenging question. I think you have to draw one major distinction. That's between Main Justice, which is the folks who are based in D.C., and the U.S. Attorney's Office. So we'll just start at Main Justice. That has the top layer, right, has a large number of political appointees, not just the Attorney General, but it's the heads of each major division, the Criminal Division, the Antitrust Division, and so on. The Deputy Attorney General, also a political appointee. Those people also all have deputies with weird titles, Principal Deputy, Assistant Deputy, so on and so forth. There's this whole cadre of political people at the highest level and people who are supporting the political people and counselors to the political people and so on. That's at the uppermost level. At the bottommost level, you have kind of line attorneys and the people who you would call career people. But there's a hierarchy there too, right? So people can sort of work their way up into supervisory positions and so on, increasingly higher supervisory positions. The middle layer is somewhat permeable. And that is the layer I wanted to actually kind of probe a little bit in the piece, because people who get into the highest levels of the career level have to also pass hiring from the political level as well, right? So they get the blessing of political people. I mean, technically, when I got hired into the lowest level position, and even technically, you have to get approved by the political people as well. But it's like a pro forma thing. The career people sign off, and the political people just take their recommendations. But at the highest levels of the career hierarchy, they're interfacing directly with the lowest levels of the political people, right? And there is some interaction there and a more complicated, I think, story to tell about how people get into those higher level career positions, because I think basically it requires the blessing of political people in a much more elaborate and formal way than it does for the lowest level people. Now, in the U.S. Attorney's offices, it's a little simpler. The U.S. Attorney is a political person. Most everyone else is a career person.
That's interesting, and we should just tell people that for an attorney in private practice, they say it's basically a 7-year partner track, right? And if you have a sense after like 3 or 4 years that you're not going to make partner, you go and look for a different place. If that's where your ambitions lie. And I'm saying that just so that like people get a sense of like, if you're looking to step up in the Justice Department and get into a different position, and you're there, and an administration's there for over the course of at least 4 years, you've got to make friends with those people, and you got to do what they want if you want to go forward. You can't afford to say, well, I'm going to wait 8 years for me to move up in my career, and hopefully there'll be an administration, that is, I find to be less, I don't know, repulsive or whatever it is, or maybe I don't even find it's a repulsive. I mean, the point being that there's a strong incentive structure to make nice with the bosses, because otherwise you could be just wasting years and years.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. And there is a level of acclamation that necessarily goes on. I think had there been 8 years of this administration, it would have been total disaster. I mean, a total disaster. It's unthinkable. I do think a lot of people probably kept their head down and did the best they could to kind of wait it out.
Right.
And, I would still say the vast majority of people, I'm sure, did honorable, excellent work. I'm talking, principally about a sort of a small layer of, I think, influential and important people. But I do think that, people sort of tried to keep their heads down and to try to wait it out for the 4-year period. But had it been 8 years, it would have been a real disaster.
All right, so let's get into some of the specifics of where you, which critical areas, and we should say there's 2 separate eras, right, of the Justice Department under Donald Trump. One is the Jeff Sessions era, one is the Bill Barr era, and maybe we should take them separately, as you do to some extent in the piece. What are the critical areas that suffered, or how did the Justice Department as an entity at large suffer under Jeff Sessions?
I think for Sessions, there were 2 major shifts, and they were in the immigration and policing spaces. These, for people, like yourself and your audience probably who've been following his career, these were not surprising at all.
Right.
Right. Jeff Sessions has been devoted his career really to opposing legal and illegal immigration. So under him, there was the rescission of DACA, there was the family separation policy, there was, a wholesale directive to the U.S. Attorney's offices to focus more on immigration cases and to charge them more aggressively than they had been in the past. A similar reorientation occurred on policing and also drug issues, I should say. But they basically unwound as much as they could of the Obama-era initiatives tied to policing reform and reinstituted a more aggressive charging policy for kind of low-level gun and drug cases principally, and reinstituted a policy that requires prosecutors to charge more mandatory minimum cases.
And so what are the long-term implications of that? It's just if you're not interested in those things under the Sessions era, your career is stunted in some way. What does it do long-term? How is it, if we decided, if Joe Biden decides okay, we're not going to be that aggressive in terms of immigration anymore. So what happens?
I actually think I don't know if it's ironic or not, but I think the Sessions era is probably actually easier to unwind than the Barr era, because you could kind of reverse the policy changes that Sessions had implemented with a series of memos. That's how it's done, memos and the like, and just direct people to go back to the old charging policy for low-level kind of drug and gun cases. People would happily do it because most prosecutors do not actually like charging mandatory minimum cases, and tell people that they can spend less time and resources charging immigration cases. And I do think there too, by and large, people would be very receptive to that, because a lot of what Sessions did was to narrow the discretion that the offices had to charge people and the things that they could charge them with. And so people, all things equal, they prefer, greater discretion on autonomy. So I don't think those things would actually be all that difficult, particularly because those initiatives had their biggest effects not in the D.C. main justice offices, but in the U.S. attorney's offices throughout the country. So, like your average assistant U.S. attorney in a border state, right, had to spend more time doing immigration cases and charging them in particular ways. That could be changed fairly easily. And some of that may already have been undone somewhat under Barr, but most of it I suspect not.
All right, so let's talk about Barr. What are where are the main areas which you think were, I guess, I don't know if corrupted is the right word, corroded the most under Barr?
Yeah, I think corroded is the better word. I think under Barr, he managed to enlist a whole bunch of offices in, protecting the president's sort of political and personal interests. And, as I mentioned, there are very obscure but important offices in the Justice Department that people don't really know about. So To give you an example, the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department provides binding legal advice on the executive branch. And it was the Office of Legal Counsel that told, I'll put it in quotes, but directed the White House that they could stonewall the House impeachment proceedings. They didn't have to produce anything in response. They didn't have to produce any witnesses. It was also LLC that supposedly advised Barr on his decision not to charge Trump with obstruction of justice after Mueller. But at the same token, another office, the Office of Solicitor General, represents the government in the Supreme Court. It's
Ankush, give me a second with the OLC, because I'm interested in this. This is also the department that essentially provided the legal justification for George Bush's torture regime. It's also, if I'm not mistaken, the department that provided the legal infrastructure for Obama's ability to assassinate, essentially, U.S. citizens, at least abroad, and brought about those Tuesday meetings. How much of what happens at the OLC is durable, right? Like, because the OLC functions as almost like, it has, in some respects, a role of almost being like and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost functions like a supplemental Supreme Court, where it has the ability to adjudicate or at least decipher what the law says. Rarely is that law, it can be actually challenged in the Supreme Court, but the president basically takes that opinion as if it was issued by the Supreme Court until the Supreme Court says something different. How durable are those holdings? I know during Watergate, I think it was, the OLC said you cannot, there's very specific and narrow times you can charge a president with a crime. And people would cite that, but couldn't a subsequent OLC say, no, we have a different finding? How much does, is there a concept of, for lack of a better term, a stare decisis, respect for precedent? How much does that exist in the OLC?
So I think the crucial point is that you can change, revoke, or rescind OLC opinions in subsequent administrations. The question, which you're getting at, is kind of how willing presidents or administrations are from time to time to actually do that. That's a matter of political will, right? Now, even within the Bush administration, there were, as you mentioned, the torture memos that were, the first round of them were extremely, extremely aggressive. And then they were somewhat controversially within the administration replaced with a narrower set of opinions. Now, practically speaking, those opinions did not do much different, but just to give you an example of a concrete way in which this can and does happen, and it's one of my suggestions in the piece is I think that this Biden administration, is my hope that they will come into this without any kind of sense that these opinions are entitled to any deference. Some of them are absurd on their face. The notion that you can just ignore congressional subpoenas, that you don't have to produce documents in response to a House impeachment proceeding. They also endorsed the view that the Ukraine whistleblowers report did not need to be handed over to Congress. And, I think OLC lawyers are supposed to be kind of elite, kind of smart, very, very smart lawyers. And I think there is a tendency for, subsequent LLCs to not just go out and just totally redo or rescind opinions. I think there is a very meaningful sense of stare decisis, but it can be done, and it's my hope that this administration will take a very, very expansive view to doing that.
Okay, fair enough. And so let's move on to the next department that you were starting on.
Oh yeah, so I was just saying, the Office of Solicitor General, right, is the office that represents the U.S. in the Supreme Court, and they too got kind of pulled into this vortex of the president's personal legal vendettas, because they were the ones who, in a critical part of the proceeding, defended the government's ability to dismiss the charges against Michael Flynn. An absurd legal rationale was offered in support of that argument, but some of the government's best lawyers were trotted out to make that argument with a straight face of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. The Civil Division, right? One thing I mentioned in the piece is the Civil Division recently, I think in August, issued a bunch of requests to governors of Democratic states asking them for information about their handling of coronavirus in nursing homes, right? Just a transparently political request for information. They also sued Yale for the sort of under one of these reverse sort of affirmative action theories.
This is the thing where they wanted to get rid of critical legal critical legal trainings as well in the government, or I guess at universities that were receiving federal funds, maybe. This
was one of the cases that alleges that Asian Americans are being discriminated against in
separate case.
Admissions. Yeah. But like the Antitrust Division has also been pulled into this as well. I mean, they were accused of having instituted like a whole series of mergers against companies, reviews of mergers in the cannabis industry because Barr doesn't like cannabis.
And there were consistently threats. I mean, I would like to see actually an healthy antitrust regime applied to companies like Google or Amazon. But it seemed to be weaponized at times as a way of disciplining these companies relative to how the president felt about them. And if I'm not mistaken, there was also one about the automakers at one point because people were pushing back on the CAFE standards.
Same thing. Yeah, exactly. The Antitrust Division got involved in that after the president tweeted out something, and a whistleblower filed a complaint saying that they had basically instituted that antitrust review solely because the president was angry.
Yeah, that's not the way it's supposed to work, is it?
No, it didn't go anywhere either because there was just nothing to produce. But no, it's not the way it's supposed to work. But, in each of those little cases, right, I mean, it's a story on some level about Trump and about Barr. But, again, this is one of the things I sort of wanted to articulate in my piece. Like, real lawyers have to do that stuff, though, right? It's not like Barr is sitting at a computer, firing off requests for information to these cannabis companies. I mean, whole slews of people are brought into that sort of ridiculous undertaking. And some of those people are probably close enough to the process to have known that it never should have been instituted and kind of kept their heads down and did it. Other people may have had no idea. But in each of these cases, right, it's not just the case that it's Barr or his senior deputies. And I think, it's a useful framing device for, I think, some people in the media and for Democratic campaigns have made this, largely about Bill Barr. But it's not. I mean, there were a lot of other people in the department facilitating the things that Barr wanted to do, and they were not all coerced to do it.
And just to be clear, part of it is that you have, obviously you have different personality types, but what it's doing is it's indicating to these lawyers that, hey, these bright lines that you have been told exist are actually not so bright. They're a little bit blurry. And here is the, here's where you have latitude. Like it exposes certain things that are probably not healthy for these attorneys to be aware of, or it basically trains people to not have as much integrity on some level. I mean, it's almost as simple as that, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, but, one other thing that I also wanted to kind of articulate in the piece is, again, this is like a large organization like any other. I mean, and by and large, it's populated with wonderful people, all of whom are trying to do the right thing. But, there are a lot of Republicans who work in the Justice Department too, right? Including at the career levels, right? A lot of people who, like, I would venture, like, were very supportive of the things that were happening. I mean, I'm not going to give you his name, but there was a guy who I used to work with who would tell me all the time about what he saw on Fox News the prior night. I mean, this was just another line attorney, right? So, like half the country voted for this president almost. Right. And so, it's like I said, an organization with 10,000 lawyers throughout the country, right? Including in states that are strongly supportive of the president, right? So there are going to be a lot of people who aren't really, in this space. It is a significant space that, that I'm glad we're talking about, where they're kind of being plied and maybe being pulled in the wrong directions. But there are a lot of people in the department who are just conservative. And there's nothing wrong with that either,
right,
by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that sorry, go ahead.
Well, what it does is it empowers those people, and it allows them to sort of burrow in ideologically and make it harder for Biden to go back to my metaphor, change the direction of that big aircraft carrier. So let's talk about what Biden has to do. You have 8 suggestions. Maybe characterize, sort of the nature of those suggestions, and then, tell us a couple of the ones that you think are the most important.
I mean, I think the highest level sort of thing that I want, the overarching kind of recommendation I had was really like, they need to sort of dig into what is happening and what has happened at the department. But I think that there is a real temptation, and I hope it does not come to fruition, but in some parts of the Democratic Party, to kind of just say, like, well, once we get in, we're just going to run the place much more competently and everything is going to be much better. And it probably would be if that's all you did. But there does need to be a concerted effort, I think, to kind of figure out, well, what was really going on these past 4 years, right? And what is in the pipeline and how did it get there, right? And to give you like a couple of concrete examples, one thing that I think kind of has to be done is I think there needs to be some sort of systematic effort to figure out the scale and scope of cases and investigations, which we did and didn't hear about, that had anything to do with the president, his family, donors to the president's companies, affiliates, and the like, and what happened in those investigations. And we have no way of knowing how many of those cases existed, how they were all handled. And I don't think, the Trump cases we probably all heard about, but the family members, the donors, the Rudy Giuliani's of the world, these sort of third-tier hangers-on of this administration, I think we need to better understand kind of what the department was doing with those sorts of cases, and if anything untoward happened with those cases. And another example I'll give you is, I mentioned that sort of the internal watchdogs, I think, have sort of been asleep at the switch, to my sort of considerable dismay. And, I don't think it's good enough for the new leadership of the Justice Department to come in and kind of say, look, we're here and, we want people to, feel comfortable coming forward with their complaints and to speak up when they see or hear something wrong. I think they need to look back and kind of figure out, okay, what was happening in these offices while, all of this stuff was going on? Were there any complaints that you didn't act on? How could it possibly be, after 4 years, that the Office of Inspector General has not once criticized a senior official in the Justice Department?
They've been really well behaved during that time. Is that not possible? I'm being
I think... No, I completely understand, and it comes back to kind of my sort of crude kind of approach to this, which is, the Inspector General also could have been fired at any point, right? Like the rest of them, the 5 or 6 or whatever that got purged earlier this year, and he's not a dummy, right? Like he's going to know that there are certain red lines that if you cross, there are certain people in the administration that if you were to aggressively investigate, you're going to be fired too.
Let me just be clear on what you're saying, so that people, fully understand. We have seen the firing of Justice Department officials who did not go along with the Trump program or the Barr program, as it were. And so the implication is, it's hard to imagine that the Inspector General, if they're doing their job, is not coming across in a 10,000 lawyer, firm or enterprise. It's not coming across stuff that is problematic. And were that person to do so, come across stuff that was sort of like contrary to the to Bill Barr's agenda and whatnot, you would see that person probably fired, or at least talking about being fired, because that's the nature of this administration. And the idea that this person wasn't fired and didn't find much work, it's probably indicative of they weren't trying to find stuff.
Well, and also you may recall earlier this year, the president fired five or six inspectors general at other agencies because they had already or were planning to conduct investigations that were critical of the most senior people in their agencies. Right, the State Department IG got fired because he had an investigation into Pompeo that was ongoing, and so you look at that, and the inspector general is no dummy, right? Like, he has to know that, if you get crosswise with this administration, you could be number 6 or number 7 of the inspectors general who are fired. And you look at this department. I mean, I really, it continues to boggle my mind that this department, the Department of Justice, actually went along with, facilitated, was the active mover behind the family separation policy.
Right. And
no one has been punished. It is astounding to me. And they supposedly have a report in progress, the Inspector General, that will be critical of some senior people, including Rod Rosenstein, but somehow they didn't manage to finish it before the election. I mean, it is absurd. Possibly one of the most consequential, morally abominable policies of the last 20, 30 years of this government, and they still have a report in draft form. It's absurd.
And we also have sort of extant this whole investigation of the investigators. What happened to that? I thought, wasn't there going to be some big reveal, or is that still ongoing, or what's happening with that?
That's a very good question. There was, I think technically there is still an investigator of the investigators. John Durham, the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, investigating the origins of the Russia investigation. He charged one person back in August or September with altering an email. It was a weird little story, but it was an FBI lawyer who pled guilty to a 1001 violation. But other than that, they haven't charged anyone. They didn't produce a report, as I think Barr and many conservatives had hoped for prior to the election. And the latest reporting I had seen was basically, they're going to kind of go away quietly now that a new Justice Department is coming in. And I think the expectation is there may not be anything else on that front.
All right. So Joe Biden gets in. Who do you think is the best, you can say an individual, but also the profile of someone to be Attorney General to deal with this mess?
For me, I think the most important thing is that it be someone with a deep experience with a large bureaucracy, right? So, like a Sally Yates, she spent 30 years in the Justice Department, and she displayed some very good judgment at some very difficult times. But more to the point, she knows how every level of the office works, at the U.S. Attorney's offices, at Main Justice, and so on. Javier Becerra, right, who's the California Attorney General. I mean, that's a huge, huge law enforcement operation, right? So he is going to have experience running a huge law enforcement operation with a whole bunch of prosecutors. That, to me, is a very, very important qualification, precisely because, not just because it's a big organization, but these are the sorts of people who are going to understand well sort of the incentives and the institutional kind of changes that can occur over a sustained period of time, and who are, I think, going to be thoughtful, is my hope, about kind of how they might undertake an internal reform effort. And, that to me is a critical qualification because, there are a host of policy issues that are very important to the Democratic Party and to progressives, including around civil rights and policing issues, antitrust, as you flagged. More important for those sorts of issues and agendas is actually the people beneath the Attorney General, the people who head the Civil Rights Division, the Antitrust Division, and so on. Because those are the people who are going to have much more power over those sorts of issues. So I think at the very, very top of the organization, I think it's actually less consequential what their particular views are on any of the sort of narrower policy issues. You want to see those issues really taken up aggressively at the office level. But the names that I've seen in the press, the same names that everyone is seeing. I mean, all of these people are very well qualified. I mean, Joe Biden is not going to appoint some hacks, as far as I can tell, and they'd all be good. Doug Jones, Tom Perez would not be my first choice, but I'm sure he'd do a fine job.
Right.
All of these people, I think, would come in and have a level of professionalism and integrity to themselves that, the past two attorneys general have not.
It was a low bar. Forgive the pun. Ankush, thank you so much. It's a fascinating piece, and I guess it's something we will have a sense of. It may take a couple of years to get a sense of how well that project to reestablish that agency is, but we will see. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.